Hey, I'm Josh. I'm with Nexus magazine. This is Luca, and today we're here with Neil Quigley, who's the Vice-Chancellor of the university, and we're just having an interview catch-up and asking a few questions. So obviously the biggest problem of this year has been COVID, probably. So we'll start with the big question: how would you rate the university's response to COVID-19 as a whole?
I think that we did pretty well, but of course what we did was hardly perfect. I think the challenge was that we went into COVID really not knowing what we were getting ourselves in for on a lot of fronts, but that was true of the whole country. I was interested in some of the commentary this morning where I saw people talking about how, you know, even in February they were thinking of COVID as just another bad flu and something that, you know, would be manageable at that level. And so as we all got our heads around what was involved, and then, you know, started to think about the huge challenge of going into lockdown and how we're going to manage with that, there was an awful lot of uncertainty, and we made one or two missteps, I think, but on the whole, you know, we kept focused on the things that were important, which was trying to ensure that the students could complete the work they needed to be able to complete the semester, and maintaining support for students who were trying to work from home and offline, and also maintain support for the staff who were trying at very short notice to get papers up and running on online mode. So it was a scramble, but when you look at some of the news that continues to come out of some of the other universities, I think we did probably as well as we could have given the uncertainty at the time.
Yeah. Are there any lessons that you take away and think, you know, shit, we could have done so much better in this area?
Well, you know, one of our missteps was thinking that we might, once we were up and running with online delivery, simply be able to crash straight back into a normal mode of teaching and recover one of the weeks of the semester from the old midterm break schedule.
Mm.
And I think we quickly got the feedback from the staff and the students that probably wasn't a good idea to push it that hard, and so we did have to circle back on that. But on other fronts, I think we did quite well, and of course some of the things that we've done are likely to be an enduring change to the way we think about teaching and assessment in the university, and I think that's positive, actually. So the fact, for example, that we quickly decided that we wouldn't be able to schedule traditional 3-hour, you know, sort of in-person exams of the type we used to have in many papers has been really positive, because it's forced people to get straight to the task of thinking about alternative ways of assessment and how we can make that work for students.
Yeah, cool. So Waikato seemingly had a more empathetic approach to those who had to leave the halls than a number of other institutions. Looking at it objectively, do you think the likes of Victoria were wrong to continue to charge students?
I think we made the right decision. And I think, you know, we didn't have a lot of time to make the decision, and so when my team brought to me the choice that we had, I thought, well, it's not the students' fault, you know, that we're in lockdown, and therefore it was reasonable for the university, given the scale of the institution, to bear the risk of the accommodation payments around that. But the context is a bit different in the sense that the other universities, many of them anyway, have quite a lot of accommodation that's owned by private providers, and the universities just have a sort of take or pay agreement to fill the beds in those halls up to a certain level. So what that means when you've got an arrangement like that is that you have to pay whether the students are in the halls or not, and you're paying cash out to a third-party provider. For us, we own almost all of the built infrastructure for our halls, and so that meant that, you know, it was it was an internal revenue loss, but we didn't actually have to pay the cash out to a third-party provider when we forgave the payments for accommodation during lockdown.
Yeah. Do you think the organisation communicated effectively to all students and staff?
Well, we tried hard, but I couldn't guarantee that anything about it was perfect.
Yeah.
But you know, another aspect of what we got right was our outbound call-in program, and that reflected not just our team from the normal student services team, but volunteers from all over the university being part of that outbound call-in program. So the fact that we were able to reach out to students and check, you know, that they were doing okay, and if they had particular needs around internet connections or whatever, help them with that, I think was hugely positive. And it meant that we did communicate a lot more, because those people doing the outbound calling were in a position to ask, to answer, you know, a whole lot of questions. And also, I think we were able to follow up on the information that they provided, which gave us a lot of feedback that we wouldn't have got otherwise.
Yeah. When we first returned to campus, there was a pretty vague email about whether class was online or face-to-face, and after that, students got annoyed at the clarification emails. You seem to be you misunderstood rather than we have rethought this. Do you think there is space to do better in how the university takes ownership and communicates to students?
Oh yeah, there was a misstep in relation to that communication as well. And that misstep partly came from us not thinking through as clearly how people might interpret the communication. Interesting aspect of communication in a situation like this, that it's one thing to know what you mean, it's another thing for your communication to actually say what you mean. And in these sort of circumstances, when there's a lot of uncertainty, people spread out wondering whether to come back to campus, what's going to happen, actually you can't just say things once either. You know, you've got to both communicate with clarity and say it several different ways so that it's clear to people what is actually going to happen, and try to anticipate all of the wrinkles and the complexity in what you're proposing, which often you sort of gloss over when you're making the high-level decision.
Yeah, so from COVID came obviously a lot more online learning, so we'll jump into a few of those questions. How prepared were we for an online learning environment, given lecturers have been told to use Panopto for years?
Well, again, I think we were better prepared than most of the other universities, hence we only needed a week downtime before we got back up and running. We've had a strategy for the last 5 years of trying to get an online instance of every first year paper across the university, and we were working our way towards that. And of course, we've got a central team who were supporting staff and being able to get their papers online. So we had some of the capability that we needed already in place, some of the papers, some of the people to support it. But there's no question that, you know, quite a lot of what we did was sort of emergency mode online teaching. And the reason I think why that's worth pointing out is that, you know, online teaching in the future won't just be Panopto recordings of people doing what they traditionally did, standing in a lecture theatre reading out their notes. It will be a much different way of teaching all round. So some of what we did was a different way of teaching. Some of it was just Panopto recordings of traditional content. But we're certainly working away on trying to shift the whole mode to something that is genuinely a new way of thinking about teaching, as opposed to just video recordings of the old way of thinking about teaching.
Yeah. So do you think it was a pretty big adjustment for staff, or most of their staff?
Very.
Yeah.
The staff have worked incredibly hard this year.
Yeah.
You know, they've really been challenged, not just with the the change to the mode of teaching and the technological challenges associated with that, but just also the sheer scale of the additional student requests for assistance and commentary about what was happening in the paper.
Yeah. So how do you think that online learning compares to physical learning in terms of providing a valuable learning experience?
I think that face-to-face learning is really important, but it probably doesn't need to be face-to-face in the traditional format of large lectures with several hundred students in a room and one person speaking to them at the front. So what we need to do is identify those areas in which face-to-face teaching really adds the most value, and I think it's in smaller groups and in different ways of thinking about what teaching is from the traditional large format lecture style.
Yeah, I would agree with that. How much money did an online learning service during lockdown cost compared to a normal physical learning experience?
About the same, really, and our costs were not materially different because the cost of running the university is 60% the cost of the staff.
Yeah.
And then additional system technology costs and infrastructure costs. So actually, whether people are on campus or away from campus, the costs of delivering teaching to them are not very different.
Yeah.
So just on that, as far as the university budgets go, does the university run a surplus for years where things like this might happen? Like, are there contingency funds and things in place for?
Well, no, we don't carry cash reserves in the sense of having a lot of investments that support that. We generate a surplus and have done, say, over the past 20 years, most years, but that surplus mostly gets ploughed back into investment in the university. So each time we renovate a building, invest in new technologies, that's all, the upfront cost of that is all cash that we've accumulated from past year's surpluses and then reinvested. And at the moment with the PAR project, for example, some of that we're having to borrow, but some of it was accumulated cash from the past few years that we had earmarked to invest in there. But there's a limited cash buffer in times like this. We have a substantial asset base, which is all the things that the university owns, which means to get through a crisis we can borrow if necessary against those assets, and because we're part of the public sector, we're relatively low risk as far as lenders would be concerned. So we have that capacity to borrow, but we don't carry a lot of cash just sitting around for a rainy day.
So back to online lectures, how do you think lecturers can make online learning more engaging for students?
Well, probably I'm not the best person to ask that
Yeah.
question, and Robin Longhurst would be a good person for you to interview at some point as
Yeah.
well. But because Robin has done a lot of thinking about this. But what she's passed on to me is I think that we need to be thinking differently about the modes of teaching, and so Robin has been encouraging staff to think about delivering the core messages associated with each sections of each paper through short videos, where rather than just going through every aspect of that idea, step by step, you give students the essence of it in a short video, and then provide ways in which they can look at the literature and explore the ideas for themselves, and perhaps come together in smaller groups once they've done that. So in the future, diversity in ways of thinking about teaching and delivering teaching material will be important, and we'll need more flexible sort of teaching and learning spaces for that to happen,
Yeah.
which is partly what the PAR is going to give us, but we may need some others as well in the
Yeah.
future.
One of my lecturers has adopted that way with online learning. She just gives us like short videos and stuff, and we meet once a week.
And do you think it works?
Yeah, I think it works pretty good. Like, it's pretty engaging. So lockdown identified some lecturers' inability to like modernise or use modern computer-based learning. What plans are there to upskill those lecturers who aren't familiar with online systems and software?
Well, as I say, we do have a central team whose role is to support staff in making that transition.
Yeah.
But you're right, obviously the staff, academic staff of the university span the full spectrum of interest and capability with technology, but we'll support those people. And it's important that we do because, as I said before, the new way in which we're thinking about teaching is not just an aberration until COVID goes away. It is going to be the new way out into the future, and so people have to adapt.
Yeah. What measures have been put in place with like both grade scaling and financial support to look after both the academic and mental welfare of students in a post-COVID environment?
Well, we feel as though we've done a lot on that front. So we introduced additional ways in which students could appeal grades if they felt they'd been disadvantaged through the COVID lockdown. We've also realised that the impact of COVID on people's study would vary quite a lot at the level of the individual. And so rather than just having scaling across everyone in a particular paper, we have tried to get down to the level of the individual. And our system now gives us the capacity to compare, say, how your particular grade in an individual paper compared with the grades that you've got in other papers similar to that over the past year or two or whatever it is. So that means that we've been able to identify those students who genuinely were disadvantaged, say by a home environment where it was difficult to study or some other thing that happened to them, and provide them with greater consideration in respect of their grades. We've also pumped a lot more money into hardship. So, we've got quite a lot of money from the government, in the order of $600,000 was distributed in that way. The university staff have been contributing to a hardship fund. Now something like 90 university staff contribute out of payroll each fortnight into the University Foundation for a student hardship fund, including about 15% of my salary over 6 months. So we've got more money to spend, and we certainly have been spending it. We've also increased our mental health support capability, so we've got now 2 mental health nurses in the health system, on the health centre I should say, which we think is really positive.
Yeah. So with all the tests and stuff being online for students now, does the university have a plan to address like the likelihood of widespread cheating?
Yeah, we do. We have noticed that much as there'll be a bit of a change from the way in which staff need to think about assessment, so we'll need to also help students understand this new world and the way that they need to operate in it. I think though that what it means is that we will need to adapt our forms of assessment much more.
Yeah.
So if you ask a group of 100 students the same question, then naturally they will talk to each other about the answer to that question. So what we're going to need in the future is a lot more assessment that is more subtle than that, and that will be more work, but that provides less scope for cooperation that the staff might regard as going over the line in terms of it being your own work.
Yeah, because I think, was it Otago that wanted students to implement some sort of software for the exams on their computers? Would you guys consider doing anything like that? Or would
there is a whole world of development in this area that's occurring. There people are working on technologies that use facial recognition or retina scanning that can track how much time you spend sitting at the computer and so on. So, and if you've gone onto particular sites or communicated with other people during that time. So there are developing technologies to do this, but the future will be not just the development of those technologies, but there'll also be assessments that are relatively immune to that sort of cooperation. I mean, let's face it, in the world of the future, open book tests will be the norm, because if you're going to let people do assignments and tests from wherever, then you can't, in the way you can in an exam room, say that it's a closed book test. So if all tests are going to be open book, well, that means the way in which we assess people will need to change to accommodate that, because you can't ask people a question where the answer is on page 32 of the textbook and expect that to be a sensible bit of assessment in an open book world.
Yeah, can vouch for that. Anyway, let's move on to, I'll hand it over to Luke for systemic racism.
First things first, Professor Quigley, thank you for being here.
Yeah,
it's been a big year.
indeed.
Just the other week, the results of the commission came out. I read the report when it came out. I subsequently watched your video addressing that. I guess the first thing I wanted to get an understanding of was, how were you feeling when you made that video?
I was feeling pleased that the report had come out with a clean result as I saw it around some of the very specific allegations, but also with a really constructive way for us to get something positive out of all of the discussion that had occurred. And it wasn't necessarily part of the mandate that the university gave Hekia Parata and Wera Gardner to come up with a process for the future, but nonetheless, by the time they'd done their task, they had views about that as well, and put those into the report, and I thought that was really valuable.
To be fair, I was pleased the way it landed as well. I was pleased to see you vindicated of some of the nastier things that were said. I know social media can be very cruel.
My first experience with social media in that sort of way, and I'm not a big social media user, so in some ways that made it easier for me. Mostly our communications team monitors social media for me, and so I was somewhat insulated from it, but not completely. And it is interesting on social media how people will say things when they're sitting at a keyboard that they would never say when they're sitting across the table from you like this. And without really realising how deeply hurtful some of those things could be. And especially for someone like me, I mean, I know I'm not perfect, but I've spent close to 40 years on my career and trying to be good at what I do. And to have people weighed in the way that some of them were was difficult, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I thought as well it was constructive, not only that the commission was announced, because a lot of institutions might just push the whole thing under the carpet, whereas the university came forward and said, right, let's investigate.
Yeah.
And I thought the conclusions overall were pretty fair. I mean, structural racism is an issue in many, many sectors of New Zealand.
Well, it's, you know, in a way, structural racism is a part of the more general evolution of institutions that's been going on forever. So one of the things I find quite interesting about this is that, of course, universities do have quite a long history, and we've come to think of universities' history as mostly being what people remember of the past 40 or 50 years. But of course, that's only one little bit of the history of universities in which universities came to be like that. And before that, say before the Second World War, universities were quite different institutions from what we think of now. And so in another couple of decades, we will be quite different institutions again. And I'm more than happy to embrace the idea that that change has to occur. And I think the specific issues about racism and, you know, the colonial structure that we inherited with the British university system when it was first brought to New Zealand, those are all really good challenges for us to look at and plan the evolution of the system over the next, you know, however many years it is.
Mm. So the next year of that's going to be fairly crucial, I mean.
Well, the next year will be crucial in developing a plan, but institutions don't in a hurry. No. So you know, I look at some of the things that I've tried to change around here and at previous universities, and you can't be in too big a hurry, otherwise it gets you get problems of a different sort arising. So that's the challenge for us. You know, we do have some very specific issues to address, but ideally a way to address them will be ways of thinking that take most of the staff of the university forward with us, because you know, we want just as many people as possible to embrace the change that we're going through, and that means that some things will be able to happen probably reasonably quickly and other things will take longer.
So there's a task force being established. Broadly speaking, what kind of changes are within your remit?
Well, we haven't tried to constrain what they'll come up with. So we're thinking of at least two phases, really. Phase one is the task force from now until Christmas. And that task force really has as broad a mandate as they want to have to look at issues. We're hoping, though, that by Christmas, that breadth of investigation will have settled down into some particular areas where we can develop action plans next year and start to implement them. So we need to go quite quickly from a very high level and somewhat theoretical in some ways discussion to some practical things that we can do, and also things that would have a chance of being fundamental in the sense of change, rather than simply being token changes on the traditional ways of thinking about things. So that there's a lot of challenge there, and it's important that we jump in and get to it immediately. But I suspect, so this is going to be a process that goes on for some time, and really the task force now and what we do next year should be the start of a long-term process. It's unlikely to be the beginning and end of it.
So one of the things, I mean, you mentioned kind of that tokenism and how there's a need for sort of deeper structural change. And I was having a read through the, not long after you started, the strategy was released for 2017 through to 2021, which we're very nearly at the end of. And I've got some questions related to that a bit further on, but this is kind of tangential to that anyway, in regards to short courses in Te Reo Māori and in tikanga, which were part of that strategy. And I've been a student at the university here for 2 years and tried to find things like that, and found that there's nothing on offer here at the university outside of the structured degree program.
Yeah, we did try to offer some, and the uptake wasn't great, unfortunately. And one of the things we realised was that on some short papers, and particularly for people community-based learning and learning outside of normal hours, that probably letting those people do that study at the Wānanga was more sensible. So yes, we could try again, but we have had a few attempts and just found that the uptake wasn't large enough really to sustain it.
Right. Okay. If you could you talk about the specifics around the pay and promotion rates of Māori academics here at the university and what action could be undertaken on that?
One of the claims that was made in the public domain was that staff in the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies were paid less than staff in other parts of the university. So that's categorically not true. And you can tell in part because they have a slightly higher proportion of professors and associate professors than other parts of the university, and of course we operate mostly on standard salary scales differentiated by academic rank. So you might well find a difference in the sense. With data, it always depends on how you cut it, so one could slice it in a variety of different ways. But we've tried to identify that and think that the way we pay people is fair. I think with promotion, we know that Māori staff are, in general, more successful or more likely to be successful when they apply for promotion than other staff. However, there may be a sort of background problem that Māori staff don't apply for promotion as frequently as other staff might. So, because there are a variety of gradations in the application process, from initial conversations with your line manager about whether it's worthwhile applying through to actually formally applying, etc. That's a little bit more complex. So there may well be some work that we can do in that area, but the formal applications for promotion that come through, we think the university's track record on that, at least since I've been here, has been positive.
And is that outside the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies?
It's both, yes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So there has been some friction even around that issue with the university moving towards divisions, and there's been some pushback against integrating that particular faculty within a division. Where does that stand now?
The arrangement we came to with Māori and Indigenous Studies reporting to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Māori is what we agreed 2 or 3 years ago, and is perfectly reasonable arrangement. So I see no reason to try to change that. With institutional structures and reporting lines, there's never just one right answer. There are different ways of doing things, and a variety of different structures can be made to work. So what I've said to people around the university is that there have been some difficulties, but I wouldn't see those as undermining the model we put in place. I don't think we've given it a chance to actually work yet, and so I'm looking forward to the discussions that have been had in recent times to settling down so that we can get back to working out how to make that new structure work. And in particular, the Māori Academic Board of Studies could be a part of the university structure that makes a really significant contribution to all the things that we've just been talking about, as well as others. But we need to get that operating in the right way to make that contribution.
We have had reports of students and academics not being able to submit into Te Reo Māori. Is that another thing under consideration at this time?
Well, This is a situation where the university's policy says one thing, and that's that they should be able to submit in Te Reo Māori. But of course, in practice, sometimes finding examiners for work and so on can be difficult. So we're committed to the ability of people to submit in Te Reo Māori. I hear from time to time concerns about that not being lived up to, but when we know about specific problems or examples, we try to deal with them, but some of the things that we're told are sort of well after the fact, and therefore it's too late for us to do anything about it.
Yeah. Do you feel that there is an opportunity for the university to come out of all this, not as an institution that is less racist, but one that could be a national leader for, or an example to the other institutions in this field?
I think there is, definitely. And, already we are in some respects. And it's an interesting aspect of the combination of institutions and people that I think by having made more progress, having more academic staff around, including more academic staff who are outside of the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies, for example, we've done a lot of really good things, but at the same time, having got that far, we of course promote a conversation about the next challenge that we confront and why we don't do even better on those things. So more voices are a good thing, but those more voices are always going to lead to the question, well, why don't we go the next step then? And what does the next step actually look like? For all of the conversation has at times been a bit difficult, I think it does show that we are making progress, that a lot of the lead in that conversation has been here, and that with the task force we've got someone in Linda Smith, who can be the co-chair and provide leadership on that. So I think there's a lot of positives. One thing you can take from the modern history of universities is that frequently there are these quite public discussions about the future of universities, about political issues in universities and so on. So I'm not the first Vice-Chancellor to have people criticising me in the public domain, and I'm sure I won't be the last. So, that's the nature of universities, and I think when I was speaking to a journalist at the end of last week, I said, you have to have a reasonably thick skin to be a Vice-Chancellor, because universities are the sort of institutions where people are going to occasionally raise these difficult questions and want public debate about it, and so you have to be prepared to go along with that.
Yeah. And should we be having them? That raises all kinds of questions around, the identity and function of a university in a society.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's the freedoms that staff in universities have, academic staff particularly, to pursue the ideas that they're interested in, and the academic freedom which is enshrined in the Education Act. That's a huge thing. And as we see institutions in other parts of the country changing, and in other countries as well, I think we increasingly should be realising just how important the freedom that's written into the Education Act for universities to pursue the things that the staff want to pursue actually is. So because of that, of course, yes, we are going to be the sort of institutions where ideally debate would be led on all sorts of things.
So this kind of ties into some of the questions around the strategy around staffing, and there's been in the news again, the job cuts recently slated. I mean, for starters, where do those stand now, as of now?
Well, with the staffing reduction, this is obviously a complex situation because with international students not allowed into the country, we have fewer students, and since a high proportion of our revenue comes, attached to students one way or another, if we have fewer students, then we need to have fewer staff one way or another. So the challenge for us is to find a way to have fewer staff, but ideally not in a way that actually means we don't offer particular programs. So we will be offering probably fewer option papers in different degrees, because often it's, as we get extra revenue from additional students coming into the university, what tends to happen is we have the money to offer additional options in particular programs, and we hire people to do that. So we'll be cutting back, and there'll be a few less options on offer in a range of areas, but we do have some programs in the university that don't cover their costs, for example, but we think those are an important part of the portfolio of subjects that we offer at the university, and so we're really most reluctant to actually stop teaching in any of those areas. So our aim is to reduce our costs as much as we can while maintaining a sense of normality for the students and for most staff around the university. With the reductions we've been able to make in other sorts of spending, cutting back on our capital program just to preserve our cash, the fact that we're not travelling at the moment internationally and only very rarely domestically, and by pushing hard to reduce people's spending on other fronts, we're probably looking at needing to save out of our salary budget across the university around 4 or 5% of the salary budget, and some of that, as I've announced several months ago, would come from not renewing fixed-term contracts, and other savings will come from people electing to retire, and us hiring lecturers or potentially delaying hiring for a semester or whatever. So we'll manage, and I hope that the impact on students, as far as a student would notice it, will be minimal.
That term, fixed term contracts, is relatively depersonalised. I mean, who does that affect? Who is that? Who's on fixed term?
Well, a wide variety of people. So there are people who sometimes have been hired to do particular bits of, as I say, teaching of electives and things like that. And so there are a reasonable number of people who are hired just annually while we consider whether to make a permanent appointment in that area, for example. There are people on fixed terms associated with specific sources of funding, whether it's research funding, postdoctoral fellowships, or other sorts of special funding from the centre of the university for a particular initiative for a period of time or whatever. But probably the majority would be people hired on short-term teaching contracts. And what I've said is that we really won't be able to afford over the next year or two to hire people for fixed-term teaching contracts, and that the permanently employed academic staff will need to find a way to teach their programs within the budget constraints that we've got.
Well, one of the other concerns that we heard a bit about was the appointments to senior management, pro vice-chancellor roles. Are there any, what are your views on the terms of this kind of top-heavy management when the frontline roles are suffering?
All people who are in senior management roles are actually on 5-year fixed-term contracts. Nobody in a senior management position has tenure in that sense, including me. So we do have positions, coming up, and we have the option to renew for another term or not with all of those. And we will be looking at some, obviously. So in one or two areas there may be options for us, but for the most part, those positions are drivers of policy and the sort of coordination that we need to manage in the current environment. When we've got less money, we need people to say, well, if we don't spend, then we can get by doing the following things. And I don't know that the costs of management in the university have increased greatly since I was here, because 3 of the Pro Vice-Chancellor roles already existed. In effect, the management role, there was already a Dean of Management who just became the Pro Vice-Chancellor, same in education. And for the Alps division, again, there was a Dean of Arts and Social Science, which was largely the position that was commuted into the Pro Vice-Chancellor. So, when we've made changes along those lines, I've always tried to be conscious that we don't want to add unnecessarily to the layers of bureaucracy. And indeed, that was part of the controversy around some of the changes, really, was the fact that I was looking to have the least cost impact, but still get the change in reporting lines that I thought we need.
There was also some comment that was perhaps a potentially insulating layer that you may not hear directly from staff about challenges on the front line.
Well, I'm here.
You are? Yes, you are.
I should have sent someone else.
Yeah.
Damn, why didn't I think of that? Yes. I mean, people say these things, but again, there are people of my age and older who have conscious memory of, universities being run with much leaner management structures, and that was true. But of course, we were also run in those days in a situation where there was a university grants committee in Wellington that allocated all the money for capital expenditure for the universities. There was bulk funding of universities, and there wasn't the same level of competition across the system, or indeed the complexity that is in the system. So just to give you an example of the sort of work that people do, the grants that we've just announced we got from MB for 3 of our really outstanding projects. We've got a Centre of Research Excellence bid in play, which I had high hopes for. Bryony James, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research, she does a huge amount of work to support the development of these bids, because interacting with MB and the Royal Society and so on, these days it's a really complex business, and you need to have someone in the centre of the university who lives and breathes the way these systems work and how to get advantage for the university out of the different funding rounds and so on. So individual academics know what they would like to pitch, but at the centre of the university we have to have people who know how what they would like to do can line up with what MB or the Royal Society or whoever it is actually wants to fund, so that they have a chance of getting the money. And so, these days, compared to when I first joined the university system, that was 1985, my first job, the system now is just so much more complex, and there's so much more to the politics of it, driven out of Wellington than there used to be.
And where do you think they'll land? I mean, are we going backwards?
Well, I don't think there's any way to avoid increasing complexity. And the reason is that, as I said before, we benefit enormously from the autonomy and the academic freedom provisions of the Education Act. But as governments increasingly look at universities and say, well, that's all very well, but what do we get for our money? And the public looks at universities and says, well, that's all very well, but we taxpayers are funding that, and is that what we really want to fund? Then we will come under increasing scrutiny, and that'll be reflected in increasing complexity in regulatory interventions out of Wellington. It will also be reflected in more and more of our funding coming for jumping over particular hurdles rather than just getting the money in bulk. Another one that's coming very fast down the pipeline is more of our money being given to us for the value we add to students. In other words, for how well we're really doing in teaching and learning, rather than just being funded per student. And as soon as you get into the question, well, how well are we really doing? And, by comparison with the students we take in after year 13 in high school, how much value are we really adding to those people? Then, you get more sophistication, but way more complication in terms of the implications for funding.
Do you have any answers to those questions?
No, but Robin Longhurst is working all day to try to figure it out. I can assure you, and she's a great person to have on the job. Yeah.
Okay, so I've got a couple of coming back to the strategy. I realize this is not quite the end of the final year of that block.
Feels like it.
Yeah, just about those.
And we need a new one, which is mostly where I've been in the spare moments thinking in the past few months. Yeah.
I can imagine. I guess generally, how do you think we've tracked against those goals? There were certain deliverables and...
Well, I think that the strategy was a creature of the challenges that I found when I first came here, and the discussions that I had with the University Council and with senior staff at the university about how we were going to address those challenges. So I think that we have made a lot of progress on some of the fronts, but inevitably a strategy is a sort of shopping list, really, and you don't end up achieving everything that's on the list. But it provides some coherence. Our strategy was much more concrete than most university strategies would be. If you look, for example, at the University of Auckland's strategy, it's 3 times the length.
Fairly nebulous.
Glad you said that. So we did put some pretty specific things in the strategy, and we've tried to achieve them. And I would say that we have started to carve out some territory. For example, one that I thought was really lacking was a sense among the public of the sorts of research areas that this university really was good at. And I knew there were a lot, but I just didn't think that the university was communicating about those things in the way that it needed to. So I think we've done a lot better now. There's a growing appreciation of the disciplines where we are strong and have been strong for a long time, and also a growing appreciation of what we've got to offer in some disciplines where I think probably our student enrolments haven't been doing us justice by comparison with what the other universities attract. So, our new marketing campaign, for example, you might ask me why it's taken me 5 years to get to that point, but again, complex organisation, working with the people who are here and thinking about what we need to change. I feel this year we've finally got to the point where, we've got an innovative marketing campaign that's got the flexibility to reflect a whole lot of different strengths of the university, and we'll keep rolling out new iterations of that marketing campaign and developing new instances of it in reflection of different disciplines around the university over quite a period of time. So that's the sort of thing which I think we've achieved a lot, but it's as I said, perhaps at the beginning, wasn't it, that in universities things don't always change quickly, and that can be challenging.
Yeah. So looking at some of those goals, have we seen higher numbers of PhD students? You mentioned earlier about some of the funding changes related to that postgraduate level.
Yes, I think we have. We certainly have been investing more in PhD scholarships, and I think that's flowed through into higher numbers of PhD students. Don't have the numbers just on the top of my head at the second, but certainly our overall, our investment in scholarships has gone up a lot in the past 5 years, and a reasonable chunk of that in the PhD program.
Are there more Māori and Pacifica faculty, more women in senior roles?
There are more women in senior roles. There's about the same number of Māori academic staff.
Okay.
As a proportion, anyway. I'm not sure of the actual numbers, but as a proportion, it's stayed about the same, around 10%.
The staff to student ratios as well was another deliverable in there. Obviously that's kind of been thrown out the window this year with COVID.
Well, yeah. No, I think what we've done is we have, and if you think back 2 or 3 years, we did stop a number of programs that were enrolling pretty poorly, and we've continued to work away on a couple where they were enrolling poorly. We'll keep the high level name, but we're going to fundamentally change the program to make it more attractive to students. So we have increased the number of students that we've got per teaching staff member. I think that's been successful. And for those programs that we've kept, even though there are relatively small numbers of students, we've made a conscious decision that we want to keep them because we feel they're a valuable part of the portfolio, even though the enrolments are relatively low.
That has an impact on the QS rankings as well. That's a metric for that. One of the other deliverables in the strategy was improvements in the university's international standing.
You know what? The way QS measures staff-student ratios is they put all academics, including those who are research funded, into the calculation. So when you look at our student-staff ratio compared to, say, Auckland University, if you just compared our social sciences with Auckland's, they'd be the same. What makes Auckland and Waikato different is that Auckland has got this huge medicine operation in which there are large numbers of people who are employed just on research funding, and they may teach a little, but only a little. And similarly, big engineering school, again, a lot of people employed on research only sort of funding. And the same is true for us in the sciences. It looks as though we have a lot of staff members per student, but in fact the reason it looks that way is we have a lot of research funded people in science and engineering, but that doesn't mean we've got more people teaching the students who are there, because those people employed on research obviously have to focus on the research to keep the contracts coming in. So even the teaching ratio, so-called, which looks at staff-student ratios, are actually heavily driven by research performance. And the bigger research operation you have and the more purely research-funded academic staff you can afford, then the better you look on that calculation, even though it's not really telling you anything about how many people actually teach students.
Right. That was most of what I had on those. You want to move to the quickfire round?
Yeah, we've got some miscellaneous questions for you, all types. So obviously it's voting season for the election. What will you be voting for in the cannabis referendum?
I'm an economist, and economists have long, proffered this adage that you should legalise it and tax it. So I'll be voting to legalise it and tax it.
Yeah, fair enough. What about euthanasia?
I think the bill that's proposed is a sensible way forward for a really, really difficult issue. So I'm supportive of that.
Yeah, cool. Do you think that your dog needs more or less airtime next year?
Well, she's getting quite a big head, I mean, she started talking about contracts and new titles and things like that. So I don't know. It is interesting how people have taken to Ella being a part of the operation, but it's sort of it's a bit of fun, and if people enjoy it, then I'm happy to keep it going, and so is she. So.
Cool.
Yeah.
Jordan or LeBron? Basketball, Michael Jordan, LeBron James.
Pass.
Pass. Are you a bongo or a memento type of bloke?
I am a bongo.
Oh yeah, fair enough. I did this morning.
Breakfast.
So a couple issues ago, we redesigned the campus. Have you read it?
No. No, I missed that one.
Oh, well, that might be a bit of trouble for this question.
I
could go through. There is a summary of everything we've done. I suppose that's there.
Where's the Vice-Chancellor's office? That's the only thing I need.
I don't know. I wrote about the retail spaces.
Right, okay.
We changed up the village green. That one's a bit exciting. You can have a bit of a skim there. Laser tag.
Oh yeah. Oh. Well, we are just about to announce, so I'll announce it now, that we're having a Boone Street Art Festival here in sometime in November. So that'll be quite exciting, and a spruce up for some of the big walls around the university.
Yeah.
So that'll be nice. I do think the built environment matters in terms of how people feel about being around the campus, and we want people to feel good about being around the campus. So I'm keen for any suggestions about anything. But,
there's plenty of suggestions in there.
Yeah.
We'll leave that one.
Go have a read of that.
Keep that as a takeaway.
Who's your favourite cricketer?
Ross Taylor.
Ross Taylor. Good choice. Do you gamble?
No. I don't approve of gambling at all.
Fair.
Again, I'm an economist, so we see gambling as a tax on the poor, and so I don't like it personally. And the limit of my gambling would be if someone really wants me to buy a raffle ticket to help raise money for something, I will, but that's as far as I go.
So you will gamble if you have to?
If it's supporting a friend or a colleague who needs to raise some money, but I don't think of it as, I don't attach any likelihood to winning the prize, I'm just giving them the money.
Yeah, that's like me in the TAB, I just give them money.
Yeah.
What do you think about the changing of the name of Hamilton and its streets?
What I think about changing the name of the streets is fine. Hamilton, I don't put any great store in the name Hamilton except for the cost that would be involved in changing it. But if we were going to change the name, I think that it would be good to come up with a name that reflected the future and people's aspirations. So the Maori language is wonderful language for being able to capture those sorts of complex ideas in the hands of really sophisticated users of Te Reo Māori. And so, you know, I understand the historical interest in Kirikiriroa, but I think a different option with a different name that had meaning for the future would be an interesting proposition if we were going to go to the trouble of changing the name.
Yeah. So we've got one last question, and I suppose you probably haven't read this issue, it's just this week's one.
Yeah, no, waiting for me back
so-
in the office.
So in this one we did the 50 worst people of 2020, and as it happens, you come in at number 10. So,
Is number 10 being better or worse than number 40?
worse.
Oh.
You're here.
Yeah. Good.
You made the last
Well,
supper.
Yeah.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
There's a wee blurb about yourself if you want to
Oh, no, I did see
read
that.
about it.
Jess told me. Yes.
tell us what you think.
What do I think? Oh, well, if it was an essay, I'd say it used quite a lot of words, but didn't say anything very specific. And I thought, well, no, that's okay. If that's the worst you think about me, then I
Yeah.
haven't done too badly, so I'm fine with that.
Yeah. Oh, and I suppose since you can vote on campus, are you going to do that this week
Vote on camp. Oh,
for the general election?
yeah, no, I hadn't thought about when or how I would do it, although I will, no doubt.
Yeah.
But probably there's a polling station almost right next to my house.
Yeah.
So I might do it there instead,
Yeah.
depending on how the day goes.
Cool. So that's all we've got.
I've got a couple more quick questions.
Yeah.
Quick fire ones.
Yeah.
Friedman or Hayek?
Friedman.
Neoliberalism, future-proof or dustbin of history?
Well, neither really, but you know, what a lot of people call neoliberal ideas have really changed the way we operate. Not all of them for the better, but nonetheless, the ones that will endure are, I think, for the better. And if you think about it this way, a lot of the reforms of the fourth Labour government, which would now be described as neoliberal by a lot of people, actually have endured. Some of them were unwound, but actually a lot of the basics of what the fourth Labour government did have endured because they were doing pretty much the right thing on many fronts.
For a net good, or, I mean, some of these things
Yeah.
have cost us a lot to unwind.
But, you know, lots of things that governments do turn out not to be ideal and need to get unwound. But, you know, the fourth Labour government, I think they did a lot of things that have stayed with us and will stay with us, I think.
Cool. Who do you consider your role models or heroes? Not something I think a lot about, actually. Who did you look up to as a kid?
But I did have people who I looked on as role models as I was growing up. So some teachers at high school, a guy who was my master's thesis supervisor at Canterbury and who persuaded me, to go up and do a PhD. The guy who was my principal PhD supervisor and so on, those sorts of things. But beyond that, no, it's not something I think pretty narrowly in academic terms, I suppose, about questions like that.
Okay. What, any book recommendations for 2020?
I've just finished reading a new biography of Oscar Wilde. It's quite monumental, it's 700 or 800 pages, but it's a terrific read. So I would I'd recommend that for anybody who wants that. I like reading biography that's very firmly set in a historical context as well. So it's a combination biography come work of history. So I consume a reasonable amount of that one at the time.
Cool. And the last question I had came from one of our readers. What do you want to be remembered for?
I'd like to be remembered for giving this university a greater sense of aspiration than it had when I came here, and for a sense of self-belief at this university in taking on Auckland and Victoria and Massey and AUT in terms of our place on the national and international stage.
Cool. Well, that's all I had.
That's all we've got. Thank you for
Yeah,
coming
okay,
in
well,
and
my
catching
pleasure.
up with us.
That was fun. We should do it more often.
We should. Yeah. Well, next year.